This video from ITFreeTraining will look at the minimum and recommended requirements for Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. Making the right choice for the requirements will allow you to get the best performance out of Windows Server for your needs. In order to install Windows Server 2012, you need to meet the following hardware requirements. You require a 1.4 GHz 64-bit processor, 512 megabytes of RAM, and 32 gigabytes of available hard disk space. The minimum requirements listed are for the Essentials edition of Windows Server 2012. Microsoft has not released a general minimum or recommended requirements for Windows Server 2012, as these values would vary depending on what the server was being used for. Microsoft does, however, release hardware requirements for particular roles. For example, if you wanted to add the Active Directory Federation Services role, Microsoft recommends 4 gigabytes of RAM and 100 megabytes of drive space. For this reason, it is up to the administrator to perform their own research of what they are planning to use the server for and up the requirements as required. If you attempt to install Windows Server 2012 with less than the install requirements, the install may fail. In the case of a virtual machine, Microsoft recommends that you increase the amount of RAM to 800 megabytes for the install. Once the install is complete, you can reduce the install to 512 megabytes. 32 gigabytes of drive space is enough to install Windows if you have less than 16 gigabytes of RAM. If you have more than 16 gigabytes of RAM, the system may have problems creating the paging file, so it is recommended to increase the amount of drive space when using a lot of RAM. The install requirements are enough to get Windows up and running. However, they may not give the best user experience even for basic operations. For this reason, I would personally recommend increasing the RAM and drive space. In our testing environment, we use 2 gigabytes of RAM and 100 gigabytes of drive space. This allows us to install additional roles and test them out. For a production environment, depending on your needs, you may even want to go higher than this. Lastly, it should be remembered that the Essentials edition requires a network card in order to be installed. If setup cannot detect and install device drivers for the network card, or the administrator is not able to provide network drivers for the network card, the install will fail. This can make Essentials difficult to install on a virtual machine. However, you would not normally install the Essentials edition on a virtual machine. Microsoft also lists some optional requirements. None of these optional requirements will prevent Windows Server 2012 from installing, but are recommended to get a better experience from Windows. First, Microsoft recommends a DVD drive. Nowadays, there are so many different ways to install Windows, you can install Windows without a DVD drive. Software manufacturers are, more than ever before, providing simple ways to download software from the Internet, eliminating the need for the DVD drive. If you have a lot of servers, it is often cheaper to buy a single USB-based DVD drive and use it as required rather than installing individual DVD drives on each server. The next requirement is a Super VGA or higher monitor. This essentially means a monitor that can support 800 by 600 or higher. With remote administration becoming more common, in some cases after the initial install and configuration is complete, the administrator may never physically visit the server, or only very rarely. The next requirement is a keyboard and mouse. Once again, with remote administration becoming the norm, this may only be required for the initial install. A lot of companies will save money by purchasing KVMs to reduce the number of monitors, keyboards, and mice required. If you decide to remove the keyboard after the install, check the BIOS setting and make sure the computer will still boot if no keyboard is installed. Some computers have BIOS settings that will prevent the computer from booting if no keyboard is detected during boot up. To ensure the computer will always boot after a reboot or power loss, make sure the BIOS is configured to not stop if a keyboard is not detected. The last requirement is Internet access. In some cases, you may install Windows Server on a secure network that does not have direct access to the Internet. Windows Server will still install. However, some features require access to the Internet, for example, to download updates. However, using software like Windows Server Update services can get around such problems. This covers the basic requirements for Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. The basic install requirements are quite low, and with the low price of hardware, you should be able to exceed these requirements, giving you a better Windows experience. Thanks for watching this video from ITFreeTraining. For the latest videos, please consider subscribing to us on YouTube. Thanks, and see you next time.